War is usually measured in steel and blood. It is calculated in tonnage, in caliber, and in the grim mathematics of casualties. But in the spring of 1944, as the world held its breath, waiting for the invasion of Europe, the United States Army deployed a weapon that had no caliber and fired no shells. It was a weapon made of rubber, wood, and pure imagination. They were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. To history, they are known simply as the Ghost Army. They were a traveling roadshow of deception, a unit of artists, designers, sound engineers, and actors whose job wasn't to kill the enemy, but to drive him mad. They were tasked with the most dangerous mission of the war, to draw the fire of the Nazi war machine away from real American boys and onto themselves. Their armor was inflatable, their artillery was plywood, their strength was a lie, and if they failed, the D-Day invasion would be pushed back into the sea. To understand the Ghost Army, you have to understand the terrifying reality of 1944. Nazi Germany had turned the coast of Europe into a fortress. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had sown the beaches with millions of mines, hedgehog obstacles, and hardened concrete bunkers. He knew the Allies were coming. The entire outcome of the war hinged on one simple question: where? The Germans were convinced the attack would come at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. It made tactical sense. It was the direct route to Germany. But the Allies intended to land in Normandy, further west, on difficult beaches where the Germans least expected them. To make this work, the Allies had to sell a lie so massive, so convincing, that Hitler would keep his best panzer divisions waiting in Calais even after the first boots hit the sand in Normandy. They needed a phantom army. The story of this deception begins not in a war room, but in art schools across America. The Pentagon knew that to fool the German high command, they didn't need standard soldiers. They needed creative thinkers. They scoured the Pratt Institute, Cooper Union, and the Art Students League of New York. They drafted painters, sculptors, architects, and set designers. Among them were men who would later become legends of American art and fashion: Bill Blass, Ellsworth Kelly, Art Kane. But in 1943, they were just kids with ink-stained fingers, thrown into olive drab uniforms and told to keep a secret that could get them killed. These men were placed into the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, the visual arm of the Ghost Army. Their boot camp was a surreal mixture of digging foxholes and mixing paints. While other units practiced bayonet drills, the 603rd practiced the art of visual misdirection. Their primary tool was the pneumatic decoy. The United States Rubber Company had developed inflatable versions of tanks, jeeps, and artillery pieces. To the naked eye at 300 yards, an inflatable M4 Sherman looked exactly like the real thing. It had the right silhouette, the right shade of olive drab, even the right shadows under the turret. But up close, it was a fragile balloon. A real tank weighed 30 tons. These weighed 90 pounds. A strong wind could flip a tank upside down, revealing its hollow underbelly, a sight that would have given away the game instantly. Private Arthur Chilko, one of the artists in the unit, recalled the absurdity of it. He said, "We were trying to look formidable, but we were terrified a stray cow would puncture our entire armored division." The artists took their job seriously. They didn't just inflate the tanks, they dressed the set. They used bulldozers to carve fake tank tracks into the mud leading up to the dummies. They scattered empty ration cans and laundry lines around the fake tanks to simulate human habitation. They knew that German reconnaissance pilots flew high and fast. The pilot had seconds to snap a photo. If the photo showed a tank, tracks, and a latrine, the German intelligence analysts would count it as a tank division. But visuals were only one part of the illusion. To truly fool the Germans, the Ghost Army had to be heard as well as seen. Enter the 3,132nd Signal Service Company, the Sonic Deceivers. Their weapon was sound, and their battlefield was the human ear. Colonel Hilton Rayleigh, a flamboyant officer with a background in journalism, had the idea to record the sounds of war and blast them at the enemy. He went to Fort Knox, Kentucky, with a team of sound engineers from Bell Labs. They spent weeks recording every specific noise an army makes. They didn't just record noise, they recorded the specific squeak of a Sherman tank tread, the heavy thud of a half-track door closing, the swearing of sergeants, the building of a pontoon bridge. They categorized these sounds onto wire recorders, the ancestors of the tape deck. The technology was cutting edge and incredibly temperamental. The wire was thin and brittle. The playback machines were delicate, but the delivery system was a brute. They mounted 500-pound speakers on half-tracks. These speakers were so powerful, they could be heard 15 miles away. The concept was terrifyingly simple. Drive a few trucks to a quiet sector of the front, point the speakers at the German lines, and play the sound of an entire armored column moving into position. If they did it right, the Germans would hear the engines revving, the gears grinding, and the officers shouting. They would panic and move their reserves to block an attack that wasn't there. But if the Germans realized it was a trick, the sound trucks, sitting ducks with no armor, would be obliterated by artillery in seconds. The final piece of the puzzle was the spoof radio operators of the signal company. In World War II, radio was the nervous system of an army. commanders communicated via Morse code and voice transmission. The Germans were masters of triangulation. They listened to Allied radio traffic to map out troop concentrations. The Ghost Army turned this against them. The radio operators were trained to mimic the fist, the unique tapping style, of real operators from real divisions. If the Ghost Army was pretending to be the 2nd Armored Division, the radio operators wouldn't just send random messages. They would study the actual radio traffic of the 2nd Armored. They would copy the rhythm, the slang, and the mistakes of the real operators. They created entire fake networks, broadcasting logistical complaints, orders for fuel, and morning reports for units that didn't exist. They were essentially actors writing a script in real time, performing for an audience of German intelligence officers who were listening in Berlin. By May 1944, the Ghost Army had arrived in England. The island was sinking under the weight of men and material. The air buzzed with the energy of the coming invasion. But the 23rd wasn't sent to the front immediately. They were held in reserve, a secret weapon waiting for the right moment. Before the Ghost Army could deploy its inflatables in France, a much larger deception was already underway, Operation Fortitude. This was the strategic umbrella under which all other lies operated. The goal was to convince Hitler that the invasion force, the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG, was gathered in southeast England, directly across from Pas-de-Calais. And to command this fake army, the Allies used their most famous and most difficult general, George S. Patton. The Germans respected Patton. They feared him. They believed he was the only Allied general audacious enough to lead the invasion. So, General Eisenhower used Patton as a pawn. Patton was seen in Dover. He was photographed visiting troops in East Anglia. Radio traffic suggested he was commanding a massive force of 1 million men. In reality, FUSAG was a paper army. The fields of Dover were filled with dummy landing craft made of wood and canvas, built by British set designers. German reconnaissance planes flew over and saw the rows of tanks and the flotillas of landing craft. They reported back to Berlin, "Patton is coming to Calais." It worked. Hitler froze the 15th Army in Calais, comprised of 150,000 men and hundreds of panzers, waiting for a fight that would never come. June 6th, 1944, D-Day. The real invasion force stormed the beaches of Normandy. It was a bloodbath. Omaha, Utah, gold, Juno, sword. The world watched as the Allies clawed a toehold in Fortress Europe. But the deception didn't end when the first shot was fired. In fact, the danger was just beginning. As the Allies pushed inland into the hedgerows of Normandy, the front line became a chaotic, fluid mess. There were gaps in the line, miles of open country where there were no American troops, only vulnerability. If the Germans found a weak spot, they could drive a wedge through the Allied lines and push them back to the sea. This was the moment the Ghost Army had been built for. 2 weeks after D-Day, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops landed on Omaha Beach. They didn't look like a special unit. They carried M1 Garands and wore standard GI helmets. But in their trucks, they carried the circus. Their first nights in France were a harsh awakening. This wasn't a training exercise in Tennessee. The mud was real, the dead cows in the fields were real, and the German 88mm shells screaming overhead were very real. Private Fred Fox, a set designer in civilian life, remembered digging a foxhole on his first night. "We were artists," he said. "We were sensitive types. We didn't want to kill anyone. We just wanted to paint. And suddenly, we're in a hole in the ground in France, shaking like leaves, wondering if a panzer is going to roll over us." Their first mission was small, a test of their capabilities. But soon, they would be called upon to plug a hole in the line that could have spelled disaster. The Battle of the Hedgerows was a nightmare. The ancient French bocage, thick walls of shrubbery and earth, turned every field into a fortress. Progress was measured in yards. In August, the Allies finally broke out. The race across France began. But as General Patton's 3rd Army raced east and General Hodge's 1st Army pushed north, a dangerous gap opened up between them near the city of Brest. There was a massive stretch of the front, nearly 40 miles, defended by nothing but a light cavalry group. If the Germans attacked there, they would find an open door. The call went out to the 23rd, fill the gap. The Ghost Army moved in under the cover of darkness. They had to simulate a reinforced armored division, roughly 15,000 men and hundreds of tanks. The 23rd had only 1,100 men. They worked feverishly. As the sun set, the inflation parties began. Compressors hummed, filling the rubber Shermans with air. The artists positioned them in the hedgerows, partially obscured, just like real tanks would be. They threw camouflage nets over them, but left them intentionally sloppy so enemy spotters would find them. The sonic trucks took up positions on the flanks. At 2200 hours, they turned on the speakers. The sound of an armored column moving at night is distinct. It carries for miles. To the German sentries across the valley, the night air was suddenly filled with the terrifying acoustic signature of an American offensive buildup. Simultaneously, the radio operators began their performance. They filled the airwaves with the call signs of the 6th Armored Division. They ordered fuel trucks. They called in artillery coordinates. They created a digital tapestry of a massive force preparing to attack at dawn. But the most dangerous part of the deception was the special effects performed by the men themselves. The unit had a collection of shoulder patches from every major division in the US Army. Before going into a local town where French civilians and likely German spies were watching, the Ghost Army soldiers would sew on the patches of the unit they were impersonating. They would go into cafes, order wine, and talk loudly about the colonel and the tanks parked just outside of town. They would drive their trucks in loops, 2 men in the front, 2 in the back. They would drive through a village, circle back through the woods, and drive through again. To a spy counting trucks on the corner, it looked like an endless convoy. It was theater of the absurd. One wrong word, one loose inflatable tank, and they would be overrun. As the sun rose, the German commander in the sector looked out. He saw turrets poking through the bushes. He heard the radio chatter of an armored division. He saw the tracks in the mud. He hesitated. He had planned a counterattack against the weak American line, but now his intelligence told him he was facing a steel wall. He ordered his troops to dig in. He called for artillery support to shell the American tanks. The shells came whistling in. They exploded among the rubber Shermans. Shrapnel tore through the armor. The tanks didn't explode. They simply hissed and deflated, sagging sadly onto the grass like tired elephants. But the Germans couldn't see that through the smoke. They kept firing, wasting precious ammunition on balloons, while the real American army maneuvered around their flank to encircle them. The Ghost Army had survived its first major test. They had held the line with nothing but air. But the war was far from over, and the deceptions were about to get much more dangerous and much more personal. As the Allies approached the German border, the resistance stiffened. The Ghost Army was no longer playing games in the hedgerows of France. They were knocking on Hitler's door, and the Germans were getting smarter. They were beginning to realize that not everything they saw or heard was real. The cat and mouse game was escalating. The Ghost Army needed to evolve. They needed to pull off a trick so audacious it would save an entire city. But to do that, they would have to stay on the front lines for 7 days straight, under heavy fire, pretending to be 20,000 men, while armed only with a few .50 caliber machine guns and a library of sound effects. This was the operation that would define them. This was Operation Bettembourg. September 1944. The Allied sprint across France had hit a wall, the Moselle River. General George Patton's Third Army was running on fumes. His tanks were thirsty, his men were exhausted, and his supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. To keep the offensive alive, Patton had to concentrate his forces for a massive push at the city of Metz. But concentrating forces meant stripping them from somewhere else. Patton pulled the 6th Armored Division out of the line to reposition them for the attack. In doing so, he left a gaping, 7-mile hole in the American defenses near the town of Bettembourg, Luxembourg. This was the Moselle Gap. It was a tactical nightmare. Facing this gap was the German 11th Panzer Division, battle-hardened veterans who knew the terrain. If they realized the Americans had left, they could pour through the gap, flank the Third Army, and potentially cut Patton off from his supplies. The only thing standing in their way was the Ghost Army. Operation Bettembourg was different. In previous missions, the 23rd had acted as a reserve force, sitting a few miles behind the front lines. Now, they were the front line. For 7 days, 1,100 artists and actors had to pretend to be the entire 6th Armored Division, a force of 8,000 men. They were stretched thin along a 7-mile front, armed with little more than .50 caliber machine guns and their wits. Colonel Harry L. Reeder, the commander of the 23rd, gave the order. Look big, keep them guessing, and for God's sake, don't get captured. The men knew the stakes. If the Germans attacked, the Ghost Army wouldn't just be defeated, they would be massacred. An inflatable tank offers zero protection against a panzer shell. The deception began in the mud. The weather was atrocious. Constant rain and biting wind. This was a disaster for the rubbermen of the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. When wet, the rubber skin of the dummy tanks glistened and reflected light, making them look unnatural. A real tank is matte steel, coated in grime. A wet balloon looks like a wet balloon. The artists had to improvise. They spent their nights covering the dummies with real foliage, mud, and camouflage netting. But they couldn't hide them completely. That would defeat the purpose. They had to leave them just visible enough to be spotted by German binoculars, but obscured enough to hide the fact that they weren't real. It was a delicate dance. Too hidden, and the Germans think the line is empty. Too visible, and the Germans see the seam in the rubber. While the artists sculpted the visual lie, the sonic deceivers of the 3,132nd Signal Company went to work on the auditory hallucination. Because the 23rd was covering such a wide front, the sound trucks had to work overtime. They played Scenario Number 4, the sounds of a tank division digging in for defense. The tracks played the sounds of engines idling, hammers striking metal, and sergeants shouting orders. They even played the sound of tanks moving laterally along the line, to give the impression that the Americans were shifting their heavy armor to meet a potential attack. One soldier, Bill Blass, who would later become a fashion icon, recalled the surreal nature of the operation. He sat in a foxhole, sketching a design for a dress on the back of a ration box, while a loudspeaker 50 feet away blasted the sound of a non-existent tank brigade. "We were sitting on a powder keg," Blass said, "and we were lighting matches." The deception extended into the local villages. This was the Special Effects Department. The Ghost Army knew that as they approached the German border, the civilians were no longer universally friendly. There were collaborators and spies everywhere. Every day, Lieutenant Fred Fox would organize atmosphere teams. He would hand out patches of the 6th Armored Division, the Super 6th. "You are no longer the 23rd, he'd tell his men. "You are tankers. You're tough, you're loud, and you're looking for schnapps." The soldiers would go into bars in Bedemberg. They would deliberately complain about how tired they were from moving their tanks. They would ask where they could billet 1,000 men. They dropped hints about a coming offensive. They knew the bartender or the man in the corner might be reporting to the Germans. They were counting on it. The spoof radio operators were the glue holding the illusion together. They were transmitting perfect mimics of the 6th Armored's traffic, but they added a new layer of psychological warfare. They sent messages indicating that the 6th Armored was receiving new shipments of high-explosive shells. They coordinated fake artillery barrages. They created a picture of a unit that was not only present, but strengthening by the hour. The German intelligence officers bought it. Their maps showed the sector heavily defended. The 11th Panzer Division, which could have easily swept the Ghost Army aside, hesitated. They probed the line. On the 3rd day, the Germans fired artillery into the Ghost Army's positions. They were testing the strength of the Americans. This was the moment of truth. If the 23rd fired back with their meager weapons, the Germans would know they were facing a light force. If they didn't fire back at all, the Germans might get suspicious. The 23rd had a solution: flash canisters. These were small pyrotechnic devices that simulated the muzzle flash of a heavy gun. When the German shells landed, the Ghost Army soldiers set off the flash canisters. From the German lines, it looked like American artillery was returning fire. Simultaneously, the sonic trucks played the sound of heavy guns firing. The illusion was complete. Visual flash, sonic boom. The Germans, believing they were facing a dug-in enemy with heavy artillery, ceased their probing attacks. They decided to wait. For 7 days, the Ghost Army held the line. They didn't sleep. They didn't retreat. They played their parts until their voices were hoarse and their nerves were frayed. On the morning of the 8th day, the ground shook. But this time, it wasn't a recording. The real tanks of the 83rd Infantry Division and Task Force Polk arrived to relieve them. The Ghost Army deflated their tanks, packed up their speakers, and vanished into the rear. When the Americans eventually advanced, they found German maps captured from a headquarters in Metz. The maps showed the 6th Armored Division firmly planted in the Bedemberg Gap. The Germans had overestimated the American strength by 300%. The Ghost Army hadn't just fooled the enemy. They had held a major sector of the front without firing a single lethal shot. As 1944 turned to winter, the war changed. The rains turned to snow. The mud froze solid. The Ghost Army moved into Luxembourg City. The mood of the war darkened. The euphoria of the liberation of France was replaced by the grim slog toward the Rhine. In December, Hitler launched his last desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. The German war machine smashed into the Ardennes, catching the Allies completely off guard. During the chaos of the Bulge, the 23rd was pulled back to help secure the rear. The deception unit found themselves manning real machine gun posts at crossroads, waiting for German paratroopers. It was a reminder that beneath the theatrics, they were still soldiers in a brutal war. But as the Allied lines held and the Bulge was flattened, the eyes of the commanders turned toward the final prize, the Rhine River. The Rhine was the spiritual and physical heart of Germany. Crossing it was the final psychological blow to the Third Reich. The Germans knew this. They had blown every bridge. They lined the eastern bank with 88s and machine gun nests. To cross the Rhine, the Allies needed to do more than just attack. They needed to pull off the greatest magic trick of the war. The Ninth Army, under General William Simpson, was tasked with crossing in the north. But Simpson knew that if he attacked head-on, his men would be slaughtered in the water. He needed the Germans to believe the attack was coming somewhere else. He needed the Ghost Army, Operation Viersen. This would be the Ghost Army's magnum opus. The plan was to trick the Germans into believing that the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were preparing to cross the river at a place called Viersen, 10 miles south of the real crossing point at Wesel. This wasn't just about placing a few rubber tanks in a field. This was a massive, multi-layered production involving the coordination of real troop movements, fake wireless traffic, aerial decoys, and the full might of the 23rd's sonic deception. The artists of the 603rd were given a blank canvas of farmland along the riverbank. They had to paint a picture of an army of 30,000 men preparing for an amphibious assault. But this time, the enemy was watching from just across the water. The river was only a few hundred yards wide. The Germans were desperate, cornered, and watching every move. The men of the 23rd knew that if this deception failed, thousands of men in the real assault force would die in the cold waters of the Rhine. They began to build. They inflated hundreds of tanks and trucks. They built fake supply dumps using empty boxes. They even built a fake airfield, complete with dummy spotter planes made of canvas and wire. But the crowning achievement of Operation Viersen was the assault boats. The engineers fabricated hundreds of dummy landing craft. They laid them out on the riverbank, row after row, as if ready to be launched at dawn. At night, the sound trucks played the noises of men building pontoon bridges, the hammering of wood, the splashing of water, the revving of boat engines. Across the river, the German commanders panicked. They heard the bridge building. They saw the aerial reconnaissance photos of the tanks and boats. They were convinced the main blow was coming at Viersen. They began to shift their artillery. They moved their reserves south, away from the real crossing point, and directly toward the Phantom Army. On the night of March 23, 1945, the Ghost Army put on their final show. They simulated the chaos of a massive river crossing. 10 miles away, in the darkness, the real Ninth Army slipped their boats into the water. The Germans at Viersen waited for an attack that never came. They shelled the empty fields, destroying rubber tanks and plywood artillery. Meanwhile, the real Allied forces crossed the Rhine with practically no resistance. Casualties were incredibly light. Churchill himself would cross the river the next day. The Ghost Army had opened the door to the heart of Germany. The war ended in May 1945. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops packed up their inflatables and went home. They returned to their lives as artists, architects, and designers. But there was one final catch. They were sworn to secrecy. The Pentagon classified the existence of the Ghost Army. The techniques they developed were considered too valuable to reveal during the onset of the Cold War. For 50 years, these men couldn't tell their wives, their children, or their parents what they did in the war. When asked, they simply said, "I was in the engineers," or "I blew up bridges." They watched movies about Patton and D-Day, seeing the history they helped write, but receiving no credit for the chapters they authored. It wasn't until 1996 that the records were finally declassified. The world finally learned that the mighty columns of tanks that frightened the Nazis were filled with air, and the radio signals that confused the Wehrmacht were broadcast by actors. The Ghost Army proved that in war, deception is as powerful as firepower. They saved an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 American lives. They were the illusionists of the battlefield. They didn't win the war with bullets, they won it with imagination. In the end, their greatest masterpiece wasn't a painting or a sculpture. It was the survival of the men who came home because of them.